My guest today is Cristina Bicchieri, professor of social thought and comparative ethics at the University of Penn, director of the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics, and one of the most influential scholars working on norm formation and collective behavior. Her work is widely cited and, as we will talk about, has led to many field experiments and changes across the world. In our conversation, Cristina and I talk about how norms emerge, scale, and sometimes collapse. We look at tipping signals, self-reinforcing equilibria, and why some norms spread through a population while others fell beyond small groups. We then move to applied dimensions. Cristina takes us through the field experiments she has conducted and the patterns she has observed. She talks about how norms and legal rules evolve together, which offers a fresh perspective on the forces that regulate and constrain much of what we do. We also talk about the challenges that appear when behaviors on digital platforms and AI ecosystems evolve faster than regulation. Finally, Cristina offers concrete guidance for policymakers and firms that want to design interventions grounded in norm theory. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Keep scaling and keep skating on thin ice. As I just told you, it's been a real joy for me to have the chance to deep dive into not all, but most of your publications over the last couple of days. So I'm very excited about today's conversation. What I've done is that I divided my questions in two different parts. First, I want to talk about the foundations of norm dynamics. And then I want to see how we can apply that. And of course, being a professor of law, I will have my biases and will try to link your work towards the legal world. But coming back now to part one, you are known, amongst other things, for doing experimental work. And I thought it would be fitting for you to start by giving us a couple examples of the type of experiments that you've conducted recently.
I do different type of experimental work. So a big project I am completing now is a project on social poverty traps. So we analyze poverty across the US, both urban and rural, and we look at the role of social norms that exist within poor communities that may have been rational when they emerge within these communities, but they look like they keep the community bound in a poverty trap, basically. And we look at different areas: education, welfare, violence in response to offense, which is very important, and finally, trust. And trust is particularly important, as you can imagine, because trust helps you create getting out of your network, create different relationship, and help you also with, work health, economic health, etc. So we look at all these, and what do we do there? What sort of experimental work we do? On the one hand, survey. Okay, how do we do a survey about social norms? Basically, we look at specific behavior, how much of this behavior exists within particular communities. And then we ask about empirical and normative expectations. A very important thing that I want people to notice is empirical and normative expectation must be clearly about a reference network. And a very important mistake people may make is do not understand what the relevance reference network is. It's very important to understand that. What is the reference network? Is the people that I care about when I make a decision. And it may be the whole population, it may be a small group, and we will talk about that later on. But very important, empirical and normative expectations are measured with respect to a reference network. Okay, so the first part of the survey tells me, for example, that there is a strong correlation between empirical and normative expectation and behavior. A correlation is no causation. And so what we do next is present our respondents with vignette. Okay, and the vignette are like 2x2 factorials, hypothetical situation, very similar to the situation where they are, where we modify empirical and normative expectation and ask people what they would do if their expectation were very different. Or sometimes we don't use just themselves, but we ask about an hypothetical character, very similar to them. What we found, for example, in this study is, yes, there are social norms. So people are very responsive to many beliefs. And therefore we can say, oh, yes, there is a causal relation between this behavior and social expectation. Let's sort of generate it. So this is very, very important. This is the type of experiment we do. Yes.
Do you have in mind a couple of those norms that you studied?
Yes. On education, drop out of school. Dropping out of school is a social norm, unfortunately. Okay. Welfare, interesting. I did not imagine that welfare recipients felt bad about getting welfare. They feel that normative expectation is that they are that is not that much approved, that they are less respected. Okay, and I think this is a consequence of welfare not being universal in America, but very specific. In Europe, we have universal welfare. And here is very different. Trust, very interesting. What we see, sort of social trust, so interpersonal trust, seem to depend for many people, especially poor people, on the kind of environment they believe they are in. So bad environment, low trust, better environment, better trust. And EPO with the yet experimentally. The interesting thing is that this relationship between norms as a proxy for trust depends very much on race. And it looks as if Black people are more insensitive to how good or bad is the environment.
Thanks a lot. So that's very clear. So now I want to talk about the norm dynamics, and first starting to understand how they scale successfully. And by successfully, I do not mean that it's necessarily good, right? Because as you just explained, some of the norms may actually lead to poverty. And so what you show in your work is that norm change requires shifts in both what people believe others do and what they believe others approve. That's a two-variable system. Now, do successful interventions typically target one variable first, or do they need to shift both at the same moment to trigger a real transition?
First of all, that's a very good question. And I encountered this problem doing consulting work. I worked for a long time for the Gates Foundation on sanitation in India. And the first thing you need to do is to understand, A, is there a norm, in our case, of open defecation? And if not, how to create a sanitation norm? The interesting thing is that what we realized interviewing people and doing some RCTs, etc., that the sanitation norm is a descriptive norm. So that what you need to work on is people's empirical expectation. So showing how many people are building latrines in this case. And even more important, there is a dynamic component because you cannot lie to people. When you show a truthful dynamic, positive dynamic, so 1 year ago was only 5%, this year is 12%, so they see a trend, this has an influence on people. So in that particular case, positive trend had an influence, and the descriptive, basically, you create a descriptive norm. Now, the question could be, when does a descriptive norm become a social norm? When the empirical is accompanied by normative. When it lasts for a while. We are very accustomed to think that what is common is also good, appropriate, accepted, etc. And so very often what starts as a descriptive norm then with time, if not challenged, become a social norm. So often we are very fortunate and we can work just on empirical expectations. Sometimes you have to work also on normative expectations first, and empirical expectation will follow. We look at the dynamics of norm creation in some villages where people got really convinced that certain behavior were negative, were bad for them, etc. And when people are convinced of that, remember, these are small communities. I think these small communities, they were convinced and they started pushing each other to behave in a better way and sanctioning people. Now, sanction is accepted if it is collective. It's not me sanctioning you, it's very dangerous. It invites retaliation. So what we saw then when the small community, the small collective decide, no, we should do something else, and are prepared to sanction people who disagree, then we see that the sanction is accepted and considered acceptable, and behavior moves in the right direction. So it depends really on the situation, how large is the group, and whether the descriptive information can work just by itself versus using more of a normative approach. It really very much dependent on the group size, the situation, etc.
So let's imagine that we face the dynamic in which first you see people doing it, and therefore it creates the expectation that other people approve of it, and therefore it creates a norm. Is there some early warning signals that this is happening? Can you measure that or quantify it, or is it impossible?
Yes, that's a very good question. What is the signal that a social norm is tipping? Okay, we're reaching a tipping point. This is very, very important. There are multiple signals, and you have to pay attention to the coexistence of some of them. Only one will not do. Typically, multiple come together. One very important, in my view, is a growing gap between empirical and normative expectations. So we typically do surveys, and we can do longitudinal surveys. So see how expectations change through time. Okay. Basically, when we see that there is a growing gap between what we believe people do and what we believe people approve of, okay, so empirical expectations stay high, but normative expectation weaken, or it can be the converse. You do panel, you can see that. This is one sign, one among many, that there is a problem. The second sign is, and you can understand that again, doing vignette typically, is realizing that many people are very low thresholds. This is very, very important. What does it mean to have a low threshold? That it is enough that I realize that 30% will be changing their behavior. I am changing tooth. Okay? So my threshold is low. And there is a great sociologist, Granovetter, that studied all the dynamic of threshold. And I think they are very important. I've done work on that. And so if the thresholds seem to be relatively low in a large population, then we know that once a minority, which is very visible, minority of trendsetter moves, we will likely see a cascade. So there is, first of all, normative empirical expectation gap. Second, low threshold. Third, you can do a survey looking at how much people support a social norm, okay, in private than public discourse suggests. So there is basically with these surveys, you analyze whether there is hidden opposition. And you can see that, okay? And if many want to change, there is a lot of hidden opposition, there is low thresholds, very important, that's to be combined with low threshold, then we're close to a tipping point. Also, some people say, well, violation have to be more visible, true, and sanction may be weaker, true. Also, there is something that we like to look at, which is elites start violating social norms. Somebody powerful, somebody important start violating, then people think, oh, if they do it, I can do it, etc. So there are lots of different combinations of this element. I think you need at least 3 in order to say we are close.
Let's imagine that a norm has tipped to the point where it is spread throughout a group. And let's imagine that for some reason you want to eliminate it. Now, in complex systems, we see that sometimes they do settle in stable but undesirable equilibria.
Absolutely.
In your experience, what kinds of social norms are the hardest to shift or to eliminate because you may see self-reinforcing loops or maybe other dynamics that will make it very hard indeed to eliminate?
There are indeed norms that are very hard to shift. Well, a typical example is religious dietary rules. You don't shift that. They are there for centuries. It's something that makes my identity as a religious person. It marks me as a religious person. And so typically they are very difficult to change. Identity norms, norms that define roles. Who's a good mother? Masculinity rules. Or if you think of certain Asian countries, duty is very important. Very, very important. These are norms that really define my role in society. And they're very, very difficult to shift. In northern countries, where you come from, there are tax compliance norms seem to be very strong, even without much punishment. And, sort of embedded in who I am. I am a good citizen. Okay, there is also a moralization of the behavior. This is very important. So what all these things have in common, strong alignment of empirical and normative expectation, very strong. The sanctions can be very salient and costly. And I don't mean legal sanction, reputation, loss of identity. These are all sanctions. These rules part of one identity, so who I am, how I define myself, and they are often institutionally embedded. And I was thinking, when you were asking this question, I studied that in Italy with political parties, etc. And is very, very interesting because it's institutionally embedded. That's what the party does, and what people expect, and is also moralized. These are very difficult things to change, exactly because they combine so many elements.
Let me conclude the very first part of the conversation talking about the norms that fail to scale. Are there common patterns explaining why some social norms indeed fail to scale, or is it something that is too divergent in nature to actually be able to detect those patterns?
Well, I think an important pattern, in my view, for what I do is, again, a norm where there is a strong alignment between normative and empirical expectation is typically very strong. A norm where sanctions are salient and high cost, and there is observability, more or less, of behavior and norms that defines one identity. It's very interesting what you ask me, because I've been involved in norm nudging. And norm nudging is basically how can we change or create new norms. And it's very interesting because there is a cognitive aspect that has never been studied very well. So what I do in norm nudging, and what I have done myself, is basically give descriptive information, so change people empirical expectation, or normative information, or both. And some are successful, some are not. And my question was, why not? It looked like a good work. And the why not depends on many things that I want to list, because I think it's very, very important to realize that. One is unclear reference network. As I told you at the beginning, the reference network must be very clear. I give you an example of a good one. Michael Holsworth of BIT in England, they realized that doctors in London were giving too many antibiotics to people. And so they tried to change the practice, and not all doctors, but a certain percentage. And what they do was a reference network. They could say, most doctors in England don't give that many antibiotics. But I am in London and I say, of course, in Scotland, they have very good air. They don't get sick. But in London, we have a lot of pollution. Okay. So this is an example of think of the reference network. And in fact, Michael Holsworth was very smart. And the reference network was London doctors, not doctors somewhere else. So being very clear at the reference network. Otherwise, you allow what we call the moral wiggle room. Is them, not us. The second, the messenger must be trusted, must be credible, because people are always worried who's sending us this message, what do they want, why do they send in this message. The third is that the information must not be inconsistent with the basic beliefs that people have. And I've seen that in various cases. And last but not least is a work I'm doing. People make very asymmetric inference when they are given empirical information. For in a positive case, they will immediately infer strong normative expectation. But if you give them in a positive case strong normative information, they will not infer that most people do that. So there is an asymmetry giving empirical versus giving normative. And conversely, when the information is a negative action, there is a reversal of fortune. So normative to empirical is much stronger than empirical to normative. You have to take into account this, because I look on 22 different behaviors, and there are enormous differences, and I also explain why. But this is a very important thing to know.
You said the second criteria is that they have to trust the messenger.
Yeah.
When you are doing that, are you revealing that you are working for a university? And I'm thinking that in some countries now we see biases that all scientists are corrupt. Are you using different strategies depending on where you are deploying the nudge, or what's your approach?
This is a very good question. For example, if I did this in Africa, I did it in India, etc. I always relate to NGOs, for example, that are well known, respected, local, work with the population, etc. It's not that I go there, Cristina Bicchieri, telling you what to do. And these NGOs typically, again, are populated by local people that are generally trusted. They are part of the community. So you have to be able to do that, especially when we work with foreign communities. They don't know us. They may think, oh, the government wants that. Okay, but do we want that? Etc.
Yeah.
Obviously, this is very important. Sometimes government, even in the US, government message policy, people may not trust it because they think, of course, they want us to do that because, yes, there is always a trust issue and you have to try to do as better as you can, basically.
All right. It's a perfect bridge to part 2 of the conversation, in which I want to talk about how to apply the norm engineering and all of your work. So you talked about norm nudging, where you suggest that subtle interventions on expectations can actually shift behavior. Can you share one example of where this has succeeded and one where it has failed?
Okay. There have been lots of attempts, for example, to lower electricity consumption. And an example of success is comparing electricity consumption to the consumption of your neighbors. And this has reduced consumption. Okay, but pay attention because the language used, for example, Alcott in 2011 did a very good job, and other people did a less good job because they compared to the average network consumption. So if the average is above what I do, well, I feel permission to consume more. This is an example. On the one hand, there was a success and there was a very good comparison. On the other hand, somebody who tried to do something very similar failed because they use the wrong word, average, the comparison with the average. Same attempt to lower consumption, same reference group, your neighbors, different language, it matters.
Okay, so the lawyer in me would say one easy solution is to pass a law. And of course, it's not easy, but I'm just pretending it could be. And to say, well, we're going to cut electricity or we're going to cap how much electricity you can use, which makes me want to ask you about the relationship between norms and the legal system. Now, one guest I had on the podcast is Larry Lessig, who has developed what he calls the pathetic dot theory. And the idea is that everything is regulated by 4 constraints: the law, the market, meaning whether it's expensive or not, right? If I'm telling you can use electricity, but you're going to have to pay €1 million every month, you'll be tempted to reduce consumption. The architecture, if I'm telling you that you can do something, but it's extremely hard for you to do the thing, for physical or digital constraints, it may also lower the temptation to use it, and the social norms. Now, again, coming back to specifically the interactions between the law and the norms, what kind of interaction do you usually see? Is that something that you try to mix in your work, or are you trying to avoid it for any reason?
No. What I learned doing my work is to ask the question, are laws distant from social norm, and how distant they are? Okay, and there are very interesting work by an American legal scholar, Stoons, and by a scholar like Plateau Aldashef that studied, and it's very interesting because they studied the introduction of new laws in countries like African countries where the social norms were very different. Okay, very, very different. And what happens? The law fails in the sense that the police does not take people, jail people if they disobey the law, etc. And there is a scholar, Kahan, who, and I use his expression, talks about the difference between gentle nudges and hard shows. And I found it very useful because he said, do not impose harsh penalties against an accepted social norm. Then what do? I had the fortune of befriend Antanas Marcus, who used to be the mayor of Bogota. And he was very conscious of what the local norms were. Bearing arms, guns, is very common. But during the weekend, people go to a bar, drink, etc. There was a lot of violence. So what he did, he banned guns only on weekends. So you feel you still can use your gun, etc. I still go around with my gun, etc. But I cannot do it during weekend. And it was successful. Or, for example, I think is Aldashев who talked about they wanted to eliminate polygamy in Gabon. And, you cannot eliminate something that has lasted centuries. But what they did was make people legally decide if they want monogamy or polygamy at the beginning, make them think about that, etc. And this was quite successful. So the idea is take into account the norms that exist already and try to make the law gentle. Okay. So don't push for a rapid change that people would not support. Yeah. And it's very interesting because the legal approach can change empirical expectation, but under very specific conditions, I think. And I was looking at American, smoking laws, laws about domestic violence, sexual harassment in the workplace, etc. And I see a progressive legal norm. Think of smoking. At the beginning, there was an ordinance that say, okay, there is an area of the restaurant where you cannot smoke. And then, with time, people start agreeing with that, and then you cannot smoke restaurant or cinemas. Yeah. And now we cannot smoke nearby a school, for example. So it has moved and moved and moved very slowly. And this is very important. And if you look also laws that allows gay marriage, look at the trajectory. It has been very slow. It looks fast because you say, 30 years ago, it was starting. And it's very interesting that it goes step by step without really strongly violating people's expectations, both empirical but also normative. It's very important.
If I understand, the assumption is that if the law is not gentle, then the norms may actually counter-react in a sense.
Absolutely. Right? Absolutely. Certainly, you're not going to change things. We saw that. I did a big study. I didn't publish it because I needed more data that I couldn't find, but about African female genital cutting. Is through Africa, the African government have prohibited it, but it still take place, not in small pockets. Even in Egypt, which is the most advanced, there is a lot of that, especially in the countryside, etc. And what does it mean? It means that you have really to move away from the norm, and the law per se will not help you do that. It must be really a slower process. This was very interesting because I was looking at all these government enacting law, pretty significant severe laws, not followed.
And what about spaces where, in any case, the law will be lagging behind? And I'm here thinking digital technology, AI. Is there a way there for norms, you think, in the space?
Absolutely. I think often about that because I read on newspaper about US regulation versus European regulations, etc. When is a norm-based strategy, which is basically born out of these companies, of these groups, people who do AI, the norm is stronger, as you said, the technology and use changes very rapidly, and the law cannot keep pace with that. Second, if there is harm is very context specific and requires local knowledge. Think of AI in medicine, AI in finance. The type of harm is very specific. You know what it can be. And there are very dense networks of professional communities that can articulate and enforce the norm. Think of the financial community, think of the medical community, or the university community. We're discussing a lot nowadays what to do with AI with our students. Should we allow? How much? However, having laws is very, very important when we have high concentration. So AI is dominated by big companies. And the harm is not no law, but it is more systemic. Very important. Think of mass surveillance, children's rights, or anti-discrimination, etc. So it's very, very important that laws exist in all this context. Now, laws, again, have to work, in my view, with empirical expectations, what people expect. They cannot work against them. However, if they work with norms, they can benefit each other. But certain norms can work against regulation, and this is very, very important to realize. For example, I say norm depend on empirical and normative expectation. Expectation of whom? And suppose these expectations are basically expectations that will protect big incumbent companies. Okay? So incumbent companies that will form barriers to entry, manipulating regulation, because a small firm will not enter with this type of regulation. So you have to pay a lot of attention, about the expectations of whom. Okay? So who are the actors? And when there are big actors, they may really influence regulation and create entry barriers to these markets.
Yeah.
Which I fear is going to happen.
I was about to say that. So, of course, the law has a role to play. And as a legal expert, I wouldn't say the opposite. Now, the risk is that indeed the law can be captured and drafted in a way to benefit the big player that can actually influence the policymaker. And if not, even the fact that we have a complex legal system with many rules will benefit the large players because they can afford compliance.
Exactly. So it is very, very important. Of course, laws and norms have to go together, but the question is which norms? The norm of whom?
Yeah.
Okay. And I saw a little bit, because I am very interested in that, a little bit of the EU regulation that ask for a lot of participation of the subject involved, of the stakeholders, let's use this word, which is very important and maybe should be enhanced and regulated. Okay, so how much participation there is, how much we can observe participation, how much we can regulate, improve, implement participation. I think it's very, very important.
Yeah.
And I think this is much less happening in the US. So we always say, oh my God, Europe has so many rules, you know, the European system. It's true, but it's also important to be aware that norms can be used against regulations.
Exactly. Yeah.
And be aware of that.
Yeah. So indeed, we have two models here, the US and the EU. Of course, it's overly simplistic, but we tend to have more regulations in the EU and a bit less in the US. That tends to be true. Now, based on your experience, if someone listening to our conversation is interested in designing interventions, what would be the top 3 priorities for them based on your work in norm theory, knowing that indeed they may counter-react to regulation, they are part of a complex ecosystem of constraints, so it's not an easy question. But if you had to come up with 3 priorities as to how to design those norm-based strategies, what would it be?
Several issues. One is your legal tools should increase the observability of behavior that complies or does not comply. So try to increase observability. This is very important. And you can do that. You can mandate that. Reinforce normative expectations is also very important. Certain protection have moral standing, like protecting children or protecting privacy. And I should also, they should impose sanctions, making violating this norm costly. But observability is the most important thing. You decide that certain behavior is good behavior, certain behavior is bad behavior, and it's very important to decide which is which. You want to stress people empirical expectation. People have to see, have to be able to know, observe in inverted commas, that there is compliance with these rules. Because if you don't know that, anything can happen. I don't care, whatever I do, etc. Very, very important. And I think that going back to what we were saying before, the European mandate, if you will, that all the stakeholders are involved, etc., should also mean that what is done must be observable. Mm-hmm. Okay, you may know what is happening when you use AI. For example, I use a lot of AI. Advanced AI can do some programming for you. It's very interesting what it can do and how it has changed. And the question is, do I know that my privacy is respected? I don't know that. Mm-hmm. They say so, but for example, I never say anything personal. You know, it's all very impersonal, academic, etc. And it's not clear what they do with my information, for example. There is no clear rule apart from this very vague, oh, yes, exactly. And so I have no capability of observing whether they do the right thing or not. I don't know. And it's interesting because there is a lot of debate about, how dangerous it is, etc. Let's do something. Let's understand what is available, not available, and what we want and what we don't want. I think is very important. But I think observability in this sense, not whether they comply with certain rules, must be observable. And sanctions must be there.
Because so far what we know is that in their terms and conditions, I've actually written a paper on that. They say that they may use the data, but how exactly, that's very unclear. And we have one court case, at least in the US, saying that if necessary, they can actually take your chat with the boat and give that to a court. So in case you killed someone, just saying this out loud for my listeners, do not ask ChatGPT, how to bury that person, because this will be used against you. And the same is true if you use it for psychology or as an advisor. So indeed, there is a lack of transparency. Now, let me ask you one very final bonus question. And I think you are uniquely positioned to answer that question, if not one of the very few persons on Earth that could answer the following question.
Oh my God.
Imagine aliens landing on Earth tomorrow and observing our norms. By our, I mean, the human species. What norm would confuse them the most? And I'm asking you because you've studied that and thought a lot about norms, so you must have some perspective that we don't have.
Okay. What the alien does is observe our behavior, not our minds. And when you observe behavior, depending on the frequency of the behavior, very frequent behavior is a rule that they follow. A habit of humans, well, humans are made like that, and therefore they can only follow that behavior. Or do they know it is a choice? They cannot know that. An alien cannot know that. Unless they read our minds, is an easy job. But if you don't read other people's mind, what you observe is behavior. An alien may say, oh, this behavior is very common. And they may make an inference. Therefore, people must accept it. It's very interesting because when I study inferences, this inference could be made also by an alien, because you see behavior and then you have to infer, do they think is acceptable? The more common the behavior, the more people think it is acceptable. But whenever behavior is common, when you observe something very, very common, you may infer that people think it's okay, it's acceptable. If the alien can make this inference, as humans, we make this inference. I don't know if an alien can do that, but they can see behavior. And the more frequent the behavior is, the more they will think, oh, it's stable, is what humans do. Let's interact with them according to that. That's all.
It was Halloween just a couple of weeks ago, and I saw online an economist with a sign, which was meant to be horrific, saying correlation equals causation, which of course is horrible, right? Hence Halloween. It seems to be something very central in your research as well. Do you have any tips as to how to deal with the difference?
I do, because I see, first of all, what I do in the survey, I look for correlation between expectation and behavior. Okay? But as you know, the correlation can be one way or another way. It may be that expectation cause behavior, or that the frequency of the behavior, if I keep behaving in a certain way, I will form expectations. Exactly. And that's why I use vignettes. This is a fundamental tool that even economists now are looking at, finally. And what is a vignette? Is basically a tool that we use to decide whether the social expectation that we know exists cause behavior or not. In my theory, a social norm is determined not just by empirical and normative expectation, by the fact that our preferences are conditional on them. So we have socially conditioned preference. How do we measure that? We have to be able to measure not just, there is a correlation between behavior and social expectation, but there is a causal relationship. Using vignettes, basically using vignettes with hypotheticals, etc., we can see whether the existence of social expectations like many do, many approve, versus few do, few approve, etc., will cause a certain behavior to happen or not. I did that with a poverty study on population of 6,500 people, so a lot. And yes, norm exists. Okay, there is a causal effect of expectation on behavior, and you can only really do norm nudging when you know that, because if you don't, you will fail.
I wanted to say that for listeners, reading your work will give them a good sense as to indeed design studies in a way to separate correlation from causation. So I found it to be extremely helpful. It was a delightful conversation as well. So thank you so very much for taking the time to come on Scaling Theory. I hope to see you soon in person. I'll make it to the US and Philadelphia if that's where you're based. So I'll be in touch.
You should be in touch. Absolutely. And thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. All right.
My absolute pleasure. And to everyone out there, take care of yourself. And if you can, someone else too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.